His worn coat concealed a chilling secret. Two arrogant cops thought they were just humiliating another homeless man in a diner. Unaware their target, Colonel Darius Monroe, was a ghost from the highest echelons of military intelligence. Their petty cruelty ignited a firestorm. As Monroe's quiet defiance didn't just shatter their careers, but unmasked a sprawling web of citywide corruption, making him an unlikely symbol of justice against a system that thought itself untouchable. The stale aroma of frying oil and cheap coffee hung heavy in the air of the Daily Grind diner, a greasy spoon establishment that served as an unofficial town square for the working class. Colonel Darius Monroe, a man whose bearing suggested a hidden history far grander than his tattered trench coat implied, sat hunched over a lukewarm cup of black coffee. His movements were deliberate, his gaze distant, yet his senses remained sharp, a relic of countless years spent operating in the shadows. He had chosen this worn-out booth in the far corner, seeking the quiet anonymity that his current circumstances afforded. His disheveled appearance, a carefully constructed facade, was intended to ward off unwanted attention, but on this particular morning, it served only to invite the very scrutiny he aimed to avoid. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of Officers Blake and Ritchie, their uniforms crisp, their expressions laced with an almost casual contempt. They scanned the room, their eyes lingering on Darius for a beat too long. Blake, the older of the two, sported a neatly trimmed mustache and a perpetual smirk that seemed to mock the world. Ritchie, Sutami, younger and more eager to impress, mirrored his partner's condescending posture. They swaggered to the counter, exchanging loud greetings with the staff, deliberately projecting their authority into the otherwise mundane diner atmosphere. Their presence immediately shifted the dynamics, a subtle tightening of shoulders among the other patrons, a few whispered exchanges dying out. The tension in the diner, though unspoken, was palpable. "Well, well, if it isn't our resident street philosopher," Blake drawled, his voice carrying just enough to reach Darius's booth, yet feigning a casualness that made the remark all the more insulting. He nudged Ritchie, who let out a snicker, still nursing that same cup of coffee. "Old man, thought you'd have graduated to the gutter by now." Darius remained still, his eyes fixed on the murky liquid in his cup. He had faced down far more imposing threats than these two, yet the sting of their words, the public humiliation, was a familiar ache that never quite dulled. He was a master of self-control, years of covert operations having forged an impenetrable calm. But even steel can feel the friction of constant abrasion. He maintained his silence, a tactic he knew often disarmed or infuriated those seeking a reaction. Ritchie, emboldened by Blake's lead and Darius's apparent lack of response, stepped closer to the booth, his shadow falling over Darius's table. "Listen, pal, this isn't a homeless shelter. People come here to eat, not to look at that." He gestured dismissively at Darius's worn coat. "You got money for that coffee, or did you find it in a dumpster?" The young server, a woman named Emily, who had served Darius countless times with a quiet kindness, flinched. She started to speak, but a sharp glance from Blake silenced her. The diner's owner, Walter, a man who had seen his share of trouble but preferred to avoid it, busied himself behind the counter, polishing an already gleaming surface. The other patrons, eyes darting between the officers and Darius, pretended a sudden fascination with their food, their discomfort a tangible thing. Darius slowly lifted his head, his gaze finally meeting Ritchie's. There was no anger, no fear in his eyes, only a profound weariness that seemed to age him beyond his years. "I paid," he stated, his voice a low rumble, barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the manufactured joviality of the officers. "Just like I always do." Blake stepped up, his smirk widening. "Oh, you paid with what? Boy, pocket lint. Come on, old man. Don't make this difficult. We're just trying to keep this place respectable. Wouldn't want to scare away the paying customers, would we?" He glanced pointedly at a family in a nearby booth, who quickly averted their gaze. Some people get nervous with certain elements around. The unspoken slur hung heavy in the air. thick with racial prejudice. Darius took a slow sip of his coffee, the gesture deliberate, almost defiant. My presence here is no more an element than yours. Officer. His tone was neutral, devoid of emotion, yet the subtle emphasis on officer carried a quiet challenge. Richie scoffed. Oh, a smart one. Huh. Look, we're just doing our jobs. Public safety. You understand that? Right? Keeping the peace. He leaned closer, his voice dropping slightly, laced with menace. And sometimes, keeping the peace means getting rid of distractions. Like you. Blake chuckled, joining Richie. He gets it. He's been around the block a few times, haven't you? Granddad? Maybe even slept on a few of them. His words were a cruel jest, designed to strip away any remaining shred of dignity. The other patrons watched, transfixed by the escalating confrontation. Too intimidated to intervene. Some secretly pulled out their phones, a flicker of blue light illuminating their faces. Darius set his cup down, the clink of ceramic against saucer echoing in the sudden quiet. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his worn coat. The officers tensed, expecting a weapon, a struggle. The air crackled with anticipation. Instead, he pulled out a battered, antiquated flip phone, its plastic casing scuffed and discolored. It looked like something out of a bygone era. Blake and Richie exchanged bewildered glances, then burst into laughter. What's that? Old man calling your imaginary friend, Blake guffawed, slapping Richie on the back. You going to call the hobo hotline? Darius ignored them, his gaze fixed on the small, monochrome screen. He pressed a single button. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the hum of the diner's refrigerator and the distant city traffic. Then, a low, steady voice, calm and authoritative, spoke from the phone, audible to everyone in the suddenly hushed diner. Director Heron, you have reached a secure line. The laughter died in Blake's throat. Richie's smirk evaporated. Director Heron. The name hung in the air like a phantom, utterly out of place in this grimy diner. Their faces, moments ago alight with cruel amusement, now shifted, a flicker of uncertainty, then dawning realization, replacing their arrogance. The unexpected identity of the person on the other end of the line, a name that reverberated with unspoken power, had instantly flipped the script. The predators found themselves abruptly exposed, their authority crumbling under the weight of a single, unexpected connection. The situation had just escalated beyond their control, and the once helpless target now held an invisible, yet undeniable, advantage. The name, Director Heron, echoed in the suddenly silent diner. It was a name that carried weight, a whispered legend in certain circles, a name synonymous with the highest echelons of federal intelligence. Blake and Richie, still reeling from the unexpected sound, exchanged frantic glances. Their bravado, a flimsy shield built on petty authority, shattered instantly. The air crackled not with their condescension, but with their rapidly escalating panic. On the other end of the line, Director Heron's voice, now crisper, more urgent, cut through the diner's stunned silence. Colonel Monroe, is everything secure on your end? We received an unusual ping from your unregistered device. Status report? Darius, his expression unchanged, lifted the phone slightly so the officers could clearly hear. Negative. Director, situation is currently compromised. Local law enforcement interfering with a routine observation. He spoke in a flat, almost detached tone, as if discussing the weather. Officers Blake and Richie, badge numbers visible, 703 and 719 respectively. They've engaged in public harassment, racial slurs, and attempted unlawful removal. Standard operating procedures violated. Blake's face drained of color. Richie, who had been about to retort, choked on his words. Unregistered device. Routine observation. Standard operating procedures violated. The jargon, delivered with such casual authority by the man they had just mocked as a homeless derelict, hit them like a physical blow. Their eyes darted nervously between Darius and the antiquated phone, as if the device itself held some terrifying power. Understood, Colonel. Director Heron's voice continued, a metallic edge now discernible. We're triangulating your position. Federal assets are being rerouted for immediate extraction and incident containment. Do you require immediate intervention? A negative. Director, Darius replied, his gaze finally settling on Blake, a flicker of something cold and unyielding in his eyes. I believe a direct conversation might be instructive for the local authorities. Put me on with General Davies. General Davies. The name reverberated in the diner, louder than any shouted threat. General Arthur Davies, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the ultimate authority, the very pinnacle of military command. The patrons, who had been silently watching the spectacle unfold, now openly gaped. Whispers erupted, hushed and awestruck. Emily, the server, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief. Walter, the owner, dropped a plate, which shattered loudly on the tiled floor, the sound swallowed by the shock. Blake stumbled back, bumping into a table. General Davies, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. Who are you? The question was born of pure terror, his entire worldview collapsing around him. Darius merely held the phone to his ear, waiting. A moment later, a deeper, gravelly voice came through, unmistakable in its authority. Monroe, it's Davies. What the hell is going on? Son, my intel says you're in a diner being harassed by some local yokels. Care to elaborate, General? Darius responded, his voice losing its detached quality, replaced by a subtle firmness. I'm attempting to maintain cover for a highly sensitive domestic intelligence operation. These two officers, he gestured with a slight tilt of his head towards Blake and Richie, have compromised my position and jeopardized national security protocols through their aggressive and racially motivated actions. They've gone beyond simple harassment. General, the word compromised and national security protocols hit Blake and Richie like a physical assault. The blood drained from their faces, leaving them ashen. Their initial arrogance had given way to a terrifying realization they hadn't just insulted a homeless man. They had committed a federal offense. The sheer scale of their blunder, the gravity of the names being dropped, rendered them speechless. Understood. Colonel, General Davies' voice boomed, now clearly audible throughout the silent diner. Consider this a direct order. Hand that phone over to the ranking officer on site. And tell them if a single hair on your head is harmed, or if this operation is further jeopardized, I will personally ensure their careers are not only terminated, but their lives are made irrevocably miserable. We're talking federal charges, insubordination, obstructions of justice, and a very long stretch in a very uncomfortable place. Blake's knees visibly buckled. He looked as if he might faint. Richie, frozen in a state of terror, could only stare. Darius slowly extended the phone towards Blake. The general wishes to speak with you, officer. His voice was calm, almost courteous, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the officers' minds. Blake's hand trembled as he took the small, unassuming device. He brought it to his ear, his face pale and clammy. He could only manage a strangled hello as the full force of General Davies's wrath, relayed through the phone, began to wash over him. The immediate shift in the situation was absolute. The power dynamic, moments ago firmly in the officer's hands, had not just reversed, it had been obliterated. The mocking bullies were now terrified, facing not just a reprimand, but a career-ending, life-altering federal investigation, all because of their casual cruelty and ignorance. The weight of unforeseen consequences settled heavily on their shoulders. Blake's face was a mask of utter horror as he stammered into the phone. The words of General Davies, a relentless torrent of condemnation. Richie stood rigid beside him, eyes wide and fixed on Darius, as if the colonel might at any moment transform into a monstrous avenger. The silence in the diner was so profound that the whirring of the coffee machine sounded like a jet engine. Blake finally pulled the phone away, his hand shaking violently, and handed it back to Darius without a word, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked utterly broken, stripped of his authority and dignity. Understood. General. We'll proceed as planned, Darius said into the phone, his voice steady. He closed the device and slipped it back into his pocket. His gaze swept over the officers, then the hushed patrons, a silent acknowledgement of the public spectacle they had witnessed. Suddenly, sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly louder. Within moments, two black, unmarked SUVs skidded to a halt outside the diner, federal agents spilling out, their movements precise and coordinated. They wore dark suits, earpieces, and carried an undeniable air of authority that dwarfed the local police. Two agents, a man and a woman, moved swiftly into the diner, their eyes immediately locking onto Darius. Colonel Monroe, the female agent, sharp-eyed and efficient, asked Agent Davies, "This is Agent Chen. We're here for extraction and incident assessment." Darius nodded. "Agents, situation is contained for now. Local officers were obstructive." He gestured to Blake and Ritchie, who flinched under the federal gaze. Agent Davies, a towering man with an unreadable expression, stepped towards the local officers. "Officers Blake, Ritchie, your badge numbers have been logged. You are officially relieved of duty, effective immediately. Pending a full federal investigation into obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. Hand over your weapons and badges, now." His voice was low, but carried an iron command. Blake, still in shock, fumbled at his belt, his movements sluggish. Ritchie, however, suddenly snapped. "This is ridiculous. He's a homeless man. He entrapped us. This is a setup," he blurted out, his voice cracking with desperation. He looked wildly at the patrons, pleading for validation. "He's got nothing. He's just a bum. They can't just do this." His outburst caught everyone off guard, even Agent Davies raised an eyebrow. Blake, however, recoiled from Ritchie, sensing the self-inflicted damage. A bum, Agent Chen interjected, her voice dangerously calm. "That bum just had a direct line to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Your careers, gentlemen, ended the moment you decided to harass a decorated war hero, an active intelligence operative. Let's make this clear. You escalated a minor incident into a federal matter. Your actions have severe consequences." As Blake and Ritchie slowly, reluctantly, surrendered their weapons and badges, their humiliation was complete. They were escorted out of the diner, their heads bowed, past the stunned onlookers. The sense of a small, local victory was palpable, a burst of righteous satisfaction among the diner patrons. But the relief was short-lived. A few hours later, after Darius had been debriefed by the federal agents and had secured a new, unassuming apartment furnished by the agency, a new kind of pressure began to mount. The initial media reports, fueled by cell phone videos from the diner, painted Blake and Ritchie as villains and Darius as an unsung hero. But then, a subtle shift began. Local news channels, seemingly influenced by an unseen hand, started running stories questioning Darius's background. Anonymous sources, identified only as concerned law enforcement officials, began to leak carefully crafted narratives Darius was a rogue agent, a troubled veteran with a history of unstable behavior. There were veiled suggestions that his operation was unauthorized, that his high-level contacts were a fabrication, or that he was somehow manipulating the situation for personal gain. A local police union official, known for his aggressive tactics, publicly condemned the federal intervention as an overreach and a smear campaign against dedicated public servants. The abuse was no longer direct, it was insidious, a poisoning of the public narrative. Someone high up in the local power structure, perhaps a superior protecting Blake and Ritchie, or simply someone who resented federal oversight, was working to discredit Darius. The threat wasn't to his physical well-being, but to his credibility, his mission, and ultimately, the integrity of the justice he sought. One evening, as Darius reviewed his new intelligence brief, a blurred photo appeared on a local news broadcast, a grainy image of him, not from the diner but from a year ago, looking more disheveled, taken in a public park known for its homeless population. The accompanying story, citing anonymous police sources, claimed he had been involved in minor altercations and disturbances of the peace, subtly painting him as a problematic individual, not a victim. The tactic was clear: undermine the hero, protect the corrupt. The public sympathy he had garnered began to erode, replaced by skepticism. This was a battle Darius knew well: the fight against a well-oiled propaganda machine. It wasn't the raw, visceral abuse of the diner, but a more chilling, systemic form of betrayal. The fight was far from over. It had merely shifted from the diner floor to the treacherous battlefield of public opinion, a fight where his past could be weaponized against him by an unseen enemy desperate to protect their own. The stakes had been raised again, transforming a moment of triumph into a complex web of deceit and manipulation. Blake's face, a grotesque mask of shock and terror, finally snapped as he handed the phone back to Darius. Richie, still rigid, watched his partner crumple. The silence in the diner was absolute, broken only by the rapid pulse of Blake's shallow breaths. Darius calmly closed the flip phone, the simple click a stark punctuation mark in the heavy atmosphere. Then, the siren wail became deafening. Outside, black, unmarked SUVs screeched to a halt, federal agents pouring out with practiced efficiency. They moved with a chilling precision, their dark suits and cold demeanor contrasting sharply with the mundane diner setting. Two agents, a stern woman and a hulking man, entered, their eyes immediately fixing on Darius. Colonel Monroe, the female agent, Agent Chen, stated, her voice crisp, "Agent Davies, we're here for extraction and incident containment. Director Heron sends his regards." Darius simply nodded towards Blake and Richie. These two, Officers Blake and Richie, badge numbers 703 and 799. They initiated contact, compromised my cover, and engaged in public harassment with racial overtones. Federal charges are imminent. Agent Davies stepped forward, his presence radiating an undeniable authority that made the local officers seem like children. "Officers, your weapons and badges." Now, his voice was low, but laced with an undeniable command. "You are relieved of duty, pending a full federal investigation into obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. Failure to comply will result in immediate detention." Blake, visibly trembling, fumbled with his belt, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped his firearm. Richie, however, suddenly roared, "This is insane. He's a nobody. A homeless vagrant. He set us up. This is a witch hunt." He gestured wildly at Darius, his eyes pleading with the stunned diner patrons. "They're trying to silence us. This isn't real justice." Agent Chen's voice sliced through Richie's outburst, sharp as a razor. "That nobody officer is Colonel Darius Monroe, a decorated officer of military intelligence. You just harassed an active federal asset on a classified operation. The only witch hunt here is the one you've invited upon yourselves. Hand over your equipment." With a collective sigh of relief, the diner patrons watched as Blake and Richie, their faces etched with absolute humiliation, were disarmed and escorted out. The federal agents were efficient, their movements swift, and within minutes. The street outside was clear, save for the federal vehicles and a few curious bystanders. Darius, maintaining his placid demeanor, was whisked away. The initial public reaction was a wave of outrage and support. Cell phone videos of the diner confrontation went viral. The story of the homeless hero who turned out to be a high-ranking intelligence officer captivated the nation. Local news channels ran segments praising Darius, condemning the officers, and demanding accountability. It was a clear-cut case of justice served, but the silence from certain official quarters was deafening. No immediate statements from the local police chief, no public condemnation from the mayor's office. This calm was unsettling, a precursor to a gathering storm. Within 48 hours, the narrative began to shift. Subtly at first, then with increasing aggression, local talk radio hosts, known for their conservative leanings, started floating theories of federal overreach, questioning the legitimacy of Darius's secret mission. Then came the leaks. grainy, undated photos of Darius looking disheveled, not from the diner incident, but from months prior, began circulating on obscure online forums, quickly picked up by partisan news blogs. They were accompanied by fabricated anonymous reports claiming Darius had a history of erratic behavior and mental health challenges. A supposed internal memo from an unnamed municipal department, obviously forged, hinted at previous, undocumented incidents involving Darius and local law enforcement, implying he was a known troublemaker. The betrayal was insidious, a targeted psychological assault. A respected police union representative, a hulking man named Miller, held an impromptu press conference, condemning the smear campaign against dedicated officers Blake and Ritchie. He subtly implied that Darius was a known agitator with instability issues that led to his homelessness, suggesting the entire diner incident was a performance to discredit the police. Darius, now in a secure federal safe house, watched the news with a detached intensity. He was no longer just the victim, he was being systematically dismantled by an unseen force. The push to the edge was the realization that this wasn't about Blake and Ritchie anymore. This was a sophisticated operation to undermine his credibility, invalidate his intelligence work, and protect a deeper layer of corruption within the local system. The goal wasn't just to get the officers off the hook, it was to utterly neutralize Colonel Darius Monroe. Then, a redacted personnel file was leaked to a prominent local investigative journalist, a woman known for her aggressive, sensationalist reporting. The file, supposedly from Darius's military past, contained fabricated disciplinary actions, vague references to insubordination, and even a doctored psychological evaluation suggesting a narcissistic personality disorder. The headline that blared across the local news channel was a devastating blow, not just to his reputation, but to the very foundation of his current mission. Homeless hero or unstable operative, disturbing questions emerge about Colonel Monroe's past. The betrayal was complete. The system was fighting back, twisting his identity, weaponizing his very existence against him. He was no longer just dealing with two prejudiced officers. He was up against a well-funded, deeply entrenched network, capable of manufacturing a false reality. The ground beneath him, once solid with public support, was turning to quicksand. His mission, already delicate, now teetered on the brink of collapse, threatened by a calculated campaign of psychological warfare that sought to make him the victim, the villain. The fabricated personnel file was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Darius Monroe, holed up in the sterile confines of the federal safe house, studied the digital whispers and outright beat spreading across the menu. He wasn't surprised. He knew this game. The enemy wasn't just Blake and Ritchie, but a higher, more insidious power within the local infrastructure, desperately trying to protect itself. They weren't just discrediting him, they were nullifying the federal intervention, eroding public trust in legitimate authority, and turning the narrative on its head. The psychological evaluation stung the most, a calculated jab at his very being. Years of covert operations had taught him to compartmentalize, to bury emotion beneath layers of strategic thought. But this attack was personal, aimed at stripping him of the very credibility that defined his existence. Yet, instead of breaking him, it sharpened his resolve. This wasn't about clearing his name. It was about dismantling a corrupt system that preyed on the vulnerable and mocked justice. He saw the pattern, the common thread, the manufactured narratives, the anonymous sources, the strategically leaked misinformation, hallmarks of a well-oiled political machine. This wasn't just about covering up for two rogue cops. It was about protecting a deeper rot. His federal handlers, Agents Davies and Chen, maintained a professional distance, providing intel and managing the logistical fallout. They were efficient, but bound by protocol, unable to directly address the smear campaign without compromising ongoing federal investigations. Darius knew he needed an unconventional approach, an uncalculated variable that the system couldn't predict. That variable appeared in the most unexpected form. A few days into the media onslaught, Agent Chen received a call, It was Emily, the young waitress from the daily grind. Emily was distraught, overwhelmed by the vicious lies being spread about Darius. She wasn't just a witness, she was a participant in the immediate aftermath, having seen the officer's true colors, and she remembered something. Agent Chen, sensing the genuine distress and potential value, arranged a secure meeting. Darius, initially skeptical of civilian involvement, agreed to hear her out. Emily arrived, nervous but resolute. She had been haunted by the memory of that morning, by the public humiliation Darius had endured, and by the subsequent twisting of the truth. "They're saying you're unstable," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I saw him, Officer Blake. He was talking to someone before they came over to your table. Someone in a suit. I didn't think anything of it then, but after everything," Darius leaned forward, his focus absolute. "Someone in a suit. Can you describe him?" Emily closed her eyes, concentrating. Tall, balding, I think. And he had this really distinct silver pen clipped to his jacket pocket. He was just outside the diner. Near their patrol car, Blake walked over to him. They talked for a minute. Then Blake came back in and he and Richie started on you. It looked like he was getting instructions. A silver pen, a seemingly insignificant detail. Yet Darius filed it away. This suggested premeditation. A directed action rather than a random act of prejudice. But a conversation wouldn't be enough to counter a fabricated file. Then, Emily revealed her true, unexpected contribution. "And my phone," she continued, blushing slightly. "I was texting my friend, trying to explain how slow it was. My phone was on the counter, pointed right at the door. I actually hit record by accident when they started yelling at you. I was trying to silence it, and I didn't realize until later what I'd done. It's blurry, and it's mostly just sound. But there's a moment, when Blake walks back in, he says something to Richie just before they come to your booth." Darius's gaze sharpened. "What did he say?" Emily gulped. "He said, 'The old man's here. Time to make an example.'" And then Richie laughed. "I thought it was just them being jerks. But now, it feels different. Time to make an example." This was gold. It wasn't random harassment. It was a targeted operation. And Emily, the unassuming waitress, had inadvertently captured the moment of its inception. Darius, without a word, reached for a secure laptop provided by the agency. He instructed Emily on how to securely upload the video. The shaky footage was indeed blurry, but the audio was surprisingly clear. The casual malice in Blake's voice, the complicit snicker from Richie, it was all there. Damning evidence of their premeditated attack. Armed with Emily's overlooked recording, Darius activated his own unexpected counterstrike. He knew the journalist who had received the leaked personnel file, a cynical, ratings-driven opportunist, but every opportunist has a price. And sometimes that price is an even bigger story. He wouldn't directly contact the journalist. Instead, he used his deep understanding of information flow and clandestine networks. He orchestrated a subtle, anonymous leak, not of the video itself, but of a coded message, hinting at the existence of new, irrefutable evidence that would not only expose the officers' premeditation, but also implicate their unseen handlers in a larger cover-up. The message was designed to pique the journalist's predatory curiosity, framing it as a way to redeem their compromised story and reveal the real truth. The trap was set. The system had tried to bury him in lies. Now he was turning their own weapon, public information, and media manipulation against them. The stakes were no longer just his reputation, but the exposure of a deep, systemic corruption. The quiet, underestimated waitress had provided the spark. Colonel Monroe was ready to fan it into an inferno. The battle of narratives had just shifted dramatically, and the complacent power brokers were about to realize they had gravely underestimated their target. The anonymous, coded message landed like a well-aimed missile. The investigative journalist, a ruthless media shark named Brenda Wallace, initially dismissed it as a crackpot tip. She had already milked the homeless hero or unstable operative angle for all it was worth, basking in the ratings it generated. But the message contained a specific detail: a silver pen, a balding man, and a whisper of premeditation, tying directly into the diner incident she had already covered. Wallace's journalistic instincts, sharpened by years of chasing scoops, recognized the scent of a bigger, more explosive story. She pivoted, sensing a potential for redemption for her initially biased reporting, or perhaps just a fresh angle for more clicks. The city council, reeling from the public outcry and the conflicting narratives, scheduled a public hearing on police conduct and community relations. It was a cynical move designed to pacify the public without offering real answers. But it was exactly the stage Darius needed. The police union, led by the bombastic Miller, was there in full force, ready to defend Blake and Richie and solidify the narrative of a rogue agent. The media, including Brenda Wallace, packed the chamber, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of a brewing storm. Miller, a man whose physical bulk was matched only by his bluster, took the podium first. He delivered a fiery address, painting Blake and Richie as victims of a federal overreach, their careers unjustly ruined by an unstable individual with a vendetta. He pulled out the leaked, fabricated personnel file, waving it like a flag. Colonel Monroe, if that is even his real rank, is a troubled man, a danger to himself and others. These officers were simply trying to ensure public safety, and for that, they've been crucified by a federal bureaucracy manipulated by a pathological liar. His voice boomed, eliciting applause from a small contingent of Union supporters in the back. As Miller concluded, Brenda Wallace, armed with her new explosive lead, seized the moment. She didn't wait for official recognition. She strode to the microphone, her eyes blazing, her voice cutting through the lingering applause. "Mr. Miller, you speak of lies and vendettas, but what about the truth?" She paused, letting the dramatic silence hang. "I have received information, credible and verifiable, that suggests a deeper conspiracy at play, not against these officers, but by them, and by someone higher up." Miller's jaw tightened. "What in the name of— This is a public hearing, not a tabloid expose." Wallace ignored him. "Mr. Miller, are you aware that Officer Blake was seen speaking to an unknown individual outside the Daily Grind diner, just moments before he engaged Colonel Monroe? An individual, I'm told, who carried a distinctive silver pen." Her gaze swept across the room, landing momentarily on a man seated in the front row, a balding man in a sharp suit, a silver pen clipped to his breast pocket. The man's face went white. He was Councilman Thomas Albright, a powerful figure on the council, known for his close ties to the police union. A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber. Albright visibly stiffened. Wallace pressed on, her voice rising. "And are you aware, Mr. Miller, that there exists audio evidence, captured inadvertently, that reveals Officer Blake's true intentions just before he approached Colonel Monroe? Audio that proves this was not a random encounter, but a premeditated, racially motivated act of public shaming." Miller scoffed, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Preposterous, fabricated. You're grasping at straws, Miss Wallace, trying to salvage your reputation after your initial defamatory reporting." Wallace simply smiled, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "Fabricated, let the public decide." She held up a small, handheld device connected to the house sound system. This audio was recorded by an innocent civilian witness. It speaks for itself. A hushed silence descended. Then, through the chamber's loudspeakers, came the distinct, muffled sounds of a diner, clanking plates, distant chatter. Then, two voices, clear as day. Blake's voice, low and conspiratorial. "The old man's here." Richie's voice, a snicker really. "Time to make an example." The words, raw and chilling, reverberated through the public hearing. The casual cruelty, the explicit intent to humiliate Darius, was undeniable. The chamber erupted. Gasps, shouts, Angry murmurs, cameras flashed furiously. Miller's face was a mask of disbelief. Then fury. That's been doctored. It's a setup, he roared, lunging for the microphone. But Wallace was quicker, pulling it back. Doctored, the FBI forensics team will be happy to verify its authenticity. Mr. Miller, perhaps they'll also be interested in how a highly classified personnel file, riddled with fabricated information, was leaked to the media. She pointed directly at Councilman Albright. Perhaps they'd like to know why a man in a position of power would orchestrate such a malicious smear campaign against a decorated officer of military intelligence. Albright, cornered and exposed, rose from his seat, his face scarlet. This is an outrage. I demand order. This woman is making wild accusations. His voice cracked with panic. But the crowd, now fully aware of the deception, was no longer controllable. Boos and angry shouts drowned out Albright's protests. The explosive confrontation, captured live on camera and witnessed by a stunned public, had shifted the power irrevocably. The public was no longer a silent observer. They were an enraged jury. The truth, delivered by an unexpected ally, had ripped through the carefully constructed web of lies. And the architects of the smear campaign found themselves suddenly and violently exposed. The system had tried to bury Darius, but he had just turned their own public stage into their personal execution ground. Councilman Albright's panicked protests were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. The chamber, moments ago a controlled environment for political posturing, had erupted into a chaotic tableau of outrage. Reporters shouted questions, camera lights flashed wildly, and angry citizens surged forward, their faces contorted with fury. The damning audio, replayed endlessly by various news outlets through their mobile broadcasts, was a visceral, undeniable gut punch to the city's carefully curated image. Before Albright could make another move, two plainclothes federal agents, who had been discreetly positioned in the audience, moved with swift precision. They converged on Albright, displaying their credentials. Councilman Albright, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and aiding and abetting a federal investigation. His face, already pale, went ashen. He was handcuffed and escorted out, his desperate pleas lost in the cacophony. The sight of a prominent city official being led away in cuffs sent a shockwave through the chamber, amplifying the pandemonium. On the podium, Miller, the police union representative, stood frozen, his bluster completely evaporated. The evidence was irrefutable. His entire defense of Blake and Ritchie had just collapsed, exposed as a deliberate cover-up. As federal agents also approached him, his eyes darted around, searching for an escape route that wasn't there. Mr. Miller, an agent stated, we'd like to have a word with you concerning the leaked personnel file. You have the right to remain silent. Miller, for the first time, was truly silent. The public backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded. #Justice4. Monroe and #Corrupt City Hall trended nationally. Calls flooded City Hall and police headquarters. The public, feeling betrayed and manipulated, demanded accountability. The city's police chief, caught completely off guard by the depth of the conspiracy, held an emergency press conference, looking visibly shaken. He announced the immediate suspension of Officers Blake and Ritchie, pending a full internal and federal investigation, and pledged full cooperation with federal authorities. He also expressed profound regret for the egregious misconduct and the unacceptable racial prejudice displayed. The words felt hollow to many, a belated damage control attempt. Meanwhile, Brenda Wallace, the journalist, stood amidst the case, a grim satisfaction on her face. Her risky gamble had paid off spectacularly. Her reputation, momentarily tainted, was now soaring. She had broken the story wide open, not just exposing two rogue cops, but revealing a deeper, more systemic rot. She immediately began live reporting, her voice a mix of professional gravitas and barely contained triumph. She highlighted the role of the anonymous tipster, carefully avoiding any details that might lead back to Darius. upholding the delicate balance of their unspoken agreement. Darius, watching from a secure location, felt a grim satisfaction. The system had begun to crack. It wasn't just the arrests, it was the public outrage, the unmasking of the lies, the undeniable shift in perception. The public, once swayed by manufactured narratives, was now armed with undeniable truth. The power had shifted from the manipulators to the masses, fueled by raw, undeniable evidence. However, the fight was far from over. Albright's immediate arrest and Miller's questioning were crucial victories, but they were symptoms, not the root cause. Darius knew the deeper corruption, the shadowy networks that enabled such systemic abuse, ran far deeper than a single councilman or a union head. The swift, decisive action by federal agencies, while reassuring, also signaled a dangerous escalation. Those who benefited from the corrupt system wouldn't simply concede. They would retaliate, perhaps more subtly, but with greater force. Indeed, even as the headlines screamed about Albright's downfall, a chilling counter-narrative began to emerge in the darker corners of the internet. Forums and fringe news sites, typically dismissed as conspiracy theory hubs, started to suggest that the entire expose was a deep state operation, a federal power grab designed to discredit local governance. They spun tales of Darius being a puppet used by a shadowy federal entity to exert control. This was a direct, albeit niche, attack on the legitimacy of the entire operation, designed to erode public trust in federal institutions and create a divided public. This was the next layer of the fight, combating the unseen forces that sought to weaponize misinformation on a grander scale. Darius knew this was merely the end of the first act. The physical threat had been neutralized, the public narrative reclaimed, but the true battle for systemic justice, for dismantling the entire corrupt apparatus, was just beginning. The shift in power was undeniable, but its stability was precarious, threatened by an invisible, powerful enemy who would stop at nothing to maintain control. The true test of his resolve was yet to come. The public hearing had ripped open a festering wound, but it was just a surface incision. Darius Monroe, now operating from a secure federal facility, understood the momentum had to be seized. The arrests of Albright and the suspension of Blake and Ritchie were symbolic victories, but the architects of the smear campaign and the systemic racism they represented were still entrenched. This wasn't merely about personal vindication. It was about dismantling an entire apparatus of corruption that had thrived in the shadows of local governance. He began by meticulously sifting through the data provided by Agents Davies and Chen. Their initial investigation into the officers, once routine, had been expanded to a full-scale federal probe into the city's political landscape. Darius, with his unparalleled experience in intelligence analysis, was their most potent asset. He saw patterns where they saw isolated incidents, connections in seemingly disparate events. "This isn't just about protecting two bad cops," Darius stated, his voice calm. As he projected a complex network diagram onto a screen in the ops room, red lines connected Albright to key figures within the police union, the zoning commission, and even certain local business interests. Albright was just the visible hand. The leaks, the fabricated file, the coordinated media smear. This required significant resources, a network of complicit individuals. Agent Chen, usually stoic, nodded slowly. "We're seeing anomalies in city contracts, particularly those awarded to companies tied to Albright's campaign donors. Overpriced bids, no-bid contracts for emergency repairs that never materialized." "Exactly," Darius affirmed. The officers were a tool. Their prejudice was exploitable. The larger game was resource diversion, public funds, intended for infrastructure, community programs, even police equipment, being siphoned off. Blake and Ritchie's casual brutality was part of a culture cultivated to keep a certain segment of the population oppressed, distracted, and unable to challenge the true embezzlers. He pointed to a series of green lines, representing illicit financial transfers. The money flows through multiple shell corporations, all linked back to an offshore account. The common denominator in a law firm with deep ties to the mayor's office. This was the deeper corruption. Not just racial bias, but systematic financial malfeasance, with the public servants acting as enforcers and distractions. The counter-narrative emerging online, labeling Darius a deep state puppet, was a deliberate smokescreen, designed to fracture public trust and discredit any federal intervention. Darius recognized the tactics sow chaos, divide and conquer. It was a classic disinformation campaign, likely funded by the very individuals benefiting from the corruption. We need to connect the dots between Albright's scheme, the financial embezzlement, and this disinformation campaign. Darius instructed, who benefits most from the public focusing on a federal overreach instead of missing millions in public funds? The agents worked tirelessly under Darius's direction. They traced the anonymous online accounts spreading the deep state narrative, discovering they were operated through a secure server farm linked to a holding company owned by a prominent real estate developer named Reginald Stone. Stone was a significant donor to Mayor Thompson's campaigns and had several large-scale city contracts under his belt, some of which were now under federal scrutiny. Stone's firm received over $50 million in emergency repair contracts in the last 3 years alone. Agent Davies reported, his voice grim, no competitive bidding. And a significant portion of that money, nearly 40%, disappeared into a series of shell corporations before hitting the offshore account you identified. Colonel, this was the nexus. The racism and police brutality were a convenient smokescreen, a means of maintaining control and diverting attention while the real money was being stolen. Albright was Stone's enforcer, coordinating the public humiliation to test the boundaries of control and set an example. The fabricated leaks were to protect this larger, lucrative scheme. Darius knew they needed more than financial records. They needed irrefutable proof of the connection, a public face to the larger conspiracy. He recalled a detail from his original brief, a classified intelligence file about a high-level mole within the city's federal building. Someone who had been leaking sensitive information to organized crime elements for years. He had dismissed it as irrelevant to his current mission. But now, a chilling possibility emerged. What about the mole, Darius asked, looking at agents Davies and Chen, the ones suspected of leaking intel to organized crime. Is there a connection to Stone? Or Mayor Thompson and Agent Chen pulled up a heavily redacted file. The investigation went cold years ago. No solid leads. I want to reopen it, Darius stated, his voice firm. Stone's level of operational security for his disinformation campaign, the speed and accuracy of the leaks, it suggests he had inside access, not just to local politics, but to federal intelligence. He needed to know what the feds knew, what they were tracking. The mole isn't just about organized crime, it's about protecting this entire network. The stakes escalated further. The federal investigation, initially a response to a personal attack, had blossomed into a full-blown assault on systemic corruption, reaching into the highest levels of city power and possibly even federal agencies. Darius wasn't just pushing for justice for himself. He was leveraging his personal experience to unmask a criminal enterprise that had been bleeding the city dry for years. The initial public chaos was now a powerful wave, and Darius was riding it, steering it towards a definitive confrontation with the true orchestrators of the city's decay. The deeper layers of betrayal were beginning to unravel, piece by agonizing piece. Darius Monroe, now a relentless force, pushed the federal agents hard. The reopened mole investigation was a calculated risk, but he knew the corrupt network's weakest point was always internal betrayal. They found the mole quickly, a mid-level analyst named Kent, deep in debt, who had been funneling sensitive federal intelligence to Reginald Stone for years. Kent, caught in a sting operation orchestrated by Darius, confessed to leaking details of ongoing federal probes, including initial inquiries into Stone's suspicious contracts and even the classified information regarding Darius's assignment. His access allowed Stone to anticipate and counter federal moves, orchestrating the smear campaign with chilling precision. The revelation of a federal mole, directly connected to Stone and the city's top brass, was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. It elevated the entire affair from a local corruption scandal into a national security threat, armed with Kent's confession, corroborated by encrypted communications traced to Stone. The federal case against the developer and his political allies became ironclad. The next step was a public dismantling. General Davies, furious at the national security breach and the implications for his intelligence assets, decided to make an unprecedented move. A full-scale press conference was announced, not by the local FBI or Department of Justice, but directly by the Pentagon. A rare and deliberate show of force. The message was clear. This was no longer just about two dirty cops or a greedy councilman. It was about the integrity of federal operations and national security. Mayor Thompson, realizing the depth of the incoming storm, tried to control the narrative. He scheduled his own emergency address to the city, hoping to get ahead of the Pentagon. He denied any knowledge of corruption, condemned Albright and the suspended officers, and attempted to paint himself as a victim of their rogue actions. His voice, usually smooth and confident, wavered. He still believed he could weather the storm, distance himself from the lower ranks, and blame others, but Darius had anticipated this. He had instructed Brenda Wallace, the journalist who had become his de facto media ally, to attend the mayor's address. Wallace, a master of ambush journalism, was primed. The mayor's address began with predictable platitudes, attempts to reassure the public and deflect blame. He spoke of isolated incidents and rebuilding trust, just as he was concluding, poised to declare his innocence and commitment to reform. Brenda Wallace cut him off. "Mayor Thompson," she shouted, her voice echoing through the tense press room, "are you aware that a federal intelligence analyst, Mr. Kent, has confessed to leaking highly sensitive information directly to your top campaign donor, Reginald Stone, information that allowed Stone to orchestrate a sophisticated smear campaign against Colonel Darius Monroe, an active federal operative, and to evade federal scrutiny for years of rampant embezzlement of public funds?" The mayor's face, moments before etched with practiced concern, contorted in a mask of pure shock. He stammered, That's absurd. I have no knowledge of any such thing." Wallace didn't let up. "Absurd, mayor, or inconvenient? Is it also absurd that federal investigators have linked millions of dollars in fraudulent city contracts, awarded to companies tied to Mr. Stone, directly to offshore accounts implicated in money laundering and racketeering? And are you also unaware that a federal mole provided Stone with forewarning of federal investigations, directly compromising national security?" The questions hit Mayor Thompson like a barrage of precision-guided missiles. His carefully constructed facade shattered. He looked around wildly, his security detail moving in. But it was too late. Reporters, sensing the kill, shouted questions, flashes exploded, and the live broadcast captured his public meltdown. His denials were weak. His body language screamed guilt, just as the mayor's press conference devolved into pandemonium. General Davies, flanked by Agents Davies and Chen, and crucially, Colonel Darius Monroe in a crisp, dark suit, began the Pentagon's own press conference. The image of Monroe, no longer the disheveled homeless man, but a commanding figure of authority, was a powerful visual. General Davies minced no words. He announced the arrests of Reginald Stone and a dozen high-ranking city officials on charges ranging from racketeering and embezzlement to obstruction of justice and conspiracy. He detailed the mole's confession and the systematic nature of the corruption. He highlighted the egregious abuse of power by officers Blake and Ritchie, noting that their actions were part of a larger scheme to maintain control over a city being systematically plundered. Then, General Davies stepped aside, allowing Darius Monroe to speak. His voice, once a quiet rumble, now resonated with quiet power. For too long, Darius began, his gaze steady. The public has been told what to believe, fed convenient narratives to distract from uncomfortable truths. Today, that changes. He spoke not of personal vindication, but of systemic failure, of the courage of whistleblowers like Emily, of the need for eternal vigilance against those who would exploit power and prejudice. He laid out the evidence, calmly and clinically, outlining how the system had been used to silence dissent and facilitate grand larceny. The effect was electrifying. Darius Monroe, the man mocked and discarded, had not just cleared his name, he had become the catalyst for an unprecedented federal crackdown, exposing a cancerous network that had reached into the highest echelons of local governance. His image, once a symbol of vulnerability, transformed into one of unwavering resistance and quiet strength. The corrupt oppressors were outmaneuvered, their power stripped away by the undeniable force of truth and the unexpected defiance of a man they had scorned. The battle for justice had transformed him from a target into a symbol, a stark reminder that even the most formidable systems can be brought down by a single, determined individual. The arrests following the Pentagon's bombshell press conference were swift and decisive. Reginald Stone, pulled from his opulent penthouse, offered no resistance, his face a mask of defeat. Dozens of city officials, from department heads to lesser-known operatives in the mayor's inner circle, were rounded up in coordinated raids across the city. The charges were staggering: racketeering, embezzlement, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and a multitude of lesser felonies. The city hall was in chaos, its administrative functions crippled as federal agents seized documents and computers. Mayor Thompson, his public image shattered, resigned in disgrace within hours. His tearful resignation speech, broadcast live, was universally panned as a desperate attempt to salvage a shred of dignity. The public, fueled by Wallace's relentless reporting and the unassailable evidence presented by General Davies and Darius Monroe, demanded systemic change. Protests erupted, not just against the arrested officials, but against the ingrained culture of corruption they represented. The city was finally awake, galvanized by the audacious truth. Darius Monroe, now a figure of quiet celebrity, retreated from the immediate media frenzy. He wasn't interested in accolades or public adoration. His focus remained razor-sharp on ensuring the dismantled network stayed dismantled. He worked alongside Agents Davies and Chen, their operational dynamic now seamless, providing his unique insights into intelligence gathering and dismantling clandestine networks. The federal investigation, initially a response to a personal affront, had blossomed into a full-scale purge. The final showdown wasn't a single confrontation, but a systematic unraveling. The police union, reeling from Miller's implication in the disgrace of Blake and Ritchie, faced internal revolt. Rank-and-file officers, many of whom had secretly resented the corruption, began to speak out. Whistleblowers emerged, emboldened by Darius's courage, providing further evidence of bribery, kickbacks, and intimidation tactics employed by the now-defunct network. The justice system, once perceived as compromised, began to move with a newfound, terrifying efficiency. One evening, as Darius reviewed a newly declassified report in the federal facility, Agent Davies placed a small, unassuming newspaper clipping on his desk. It was a local police blotter entry from 2 decades prior. "Recognize this?" Colonel Davies asked, his voice low. Darius read it. A minor incident: a young black man, a former military serviceman, arrested for vagrancy and resisting arrest after a public altercation with 2 rookie officers. The charges were eventually dropped, but the man had disappeared. His life derailed. The names of the rookie officers were Blake and Ritchie. Darius looked up, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "They started early," he murmured. This wasn't the first time Blake and Ritchie had used their authority to demean and abuse. Their targeting of Darius wasn't just random prejudice, it was a continuation of a pattern, a long-standing practice of preying on vulnerable individuals, particularly those who fit a certain demographic. It was a chilling twist, solidifying the ingrained nature of their bias in the systemic environment that had allowed it to fester for decades. The system had enabled them, rewarded them, until they met their match in Darius. The case against Blake and Ritchie, already strong, was further bolstered by this historical pattern. They faced not just the consequences of their actions in the diner, but a full review of their entire careers, likely leading to further charges. The symbolism was stark. The seeds of their corruption had been sown long ago, allowed to grow unchecked until they encountered an immovable force. Darius Monroe, the man who had been mocked as a homeless derelict, became a powerful symbol of resistance. He never sought the limelight, but his story resonated profoundly. He wasn't a conventional hero. He was a quiet, unassuming man who had refused to break, who had leveraged his extraordinary past to expose an ugly truth. His actions spurred legislative reforms aimed at police accountability and transparency in city contracts. Citizen oversight committees, previously toothless, were given real power. The city, scarred but revitalized, began the long, arduous process of rebuilding trust. He eventually returned to a life of quiet anonymity, though no longer one of destitution. His mission completed, his identity secured, he vanished back into the shadows, a ghost in the machine, a silent guardian. But his legacy lingered, a testament to the idea that even the most seemingly insignificant individual, armed with an unwavering commitment to truth and justice, could ignite a revolution and dismantle the deepest networks of corruption. His story became a cautionary tale for oppressors and an anthem of hope for the oppressed. A powerful reminder that true power lies not in authority, but in integrity and defiance.